A couple months ago, I took on a commission to build a record player console that, well, didn't exactly work out. And if you watched that video or listened to the Modern Maker podcast around that time, then you probably heard me say that I was done with commission pieces. Long story short, I decided that the time it takes to do a custom piece of furniture right, to have it be the level of quality that I think it should be, and the time that it takes to keep up with my schedule for making videos just don't really work well together. So yeah, that hard line in the sand lasted for about 3 months, and today, with this project, I'm back at it. Sort of. When a guy named Ben wrote to me and asked if I could build him a record player console, and basically said, here are the dimensions that I need, and left the rest up to me, it sounded like too much fun to pass up. So I made him a deal and figured I could use this as a test case to see if I was really done with custom pieces. Alright, so far all that you've been seeing me do is glue up the hardwood panels that are going to eventually become the top and 2 side pieces, and these are made out of 4/4 walnut. Next I got out a sheet of walnut plywood and took it outside so that I could break it down. And this is going to be used for the bottom of the cabinet, the vertical partitions, the shelf, and the back panel. And in fact, before we go any further, let's talk about the design. So in the beginning you saw me making the top and 2 side pieces. And you can see here how the whole thing is shallower at the top than it is at the bottom. The idea here was to create a situation where the records are partially exposed. As I said with the plywood, I'm going to be making the back panel, a shelf, and a bunch of vertical partitions. And the partitions are actually going to be mostly plywood, but the front third or so will be made out of hardwood. So that's the cabinet, and we'll get back to the base later. With my plywood roughed out, I marked up some pieces and used my table saw to cut things down to their final dimensions. And then I cut out some hardwood edging that I could use for the bottom panel and the shelf. The bottom piece got some thin strips, but for the shelf I cut a thick piece, and that's because I'm going to put a 15-degree bevel on this piece a little bit later, so that it'll match the slant of the rest of the cabinet. And here in this shot, I should have known that this was going to happen when I was flushing up my edging, but I went ahead and fixed it, and honestly in the finished piece, you'd never even notice it if I didn't tell you about it here. Next I took my remaining plywood and cut out a bunch of pieces that are going to be the vertical partitions. After I'd cross-cut and ripped them to size, I cut out an equal amount of pieces of hardwood, and that's going to be the fronts for the partitions. So after I had them all out, I glued them together, and this might look confusing here, but this is 2 vertical partitions. Here's one piece of plywood with a hardwood front, and here's the other. Since the hardwood was a bit thicker than the plywood, I used my table saw to remove a bunch of the material, and then sanded the rest to get everything nice and flush. And then I ripped everything to the exact finished depth that I wanted. After that, I got out some marking tools and laid out where and at what angle I wanted my piece to start leaning back, and used that to set up my sled so that I could batch out all of the pieces. Here I'm cutting a rabbet into the side pieces and the top and bottom pieces. For the sides I could use my table saw since the rabbet ran the entire length of the back, but for the top and bottom I used a router because it needed to stop just shy of the edges. So that way you wouldn't see a gap if you looked at the finished piece from the side. With my sides and partitions attached to my bottom, I turned my attention to making the shelf, finishing the top, and attaching everything. So I started by attaching that thicker piece of hardwood edging that we cut a few minutes back to what will become the shelf. Then I took the last vertical partition that I hadn't installed yet and cut it down so that it'll become the support for the center of the shelf. And I know this seems like it's kind of a waste of material, but I just didn't want to think about making two different kinds of partitions, so I opted to make them all the same and then just cut one in half essentially. Anyhow, next I glued and clamped that into place, and then I could use the opening to fit my shelf just right. And after I had done that, I set my blade to 15 degrees and cut a bevel on the front of the shelf piece, and then another one on the front of the top piece. And with that, I could assemble everything and then set the cabinet aside so that I could work on the base. So the base is going to be made up of two different components, legs and stretchers, or aprons I guess. The legs are going to be 2 by 2 inches thick, so I had to put them together with two thinner pieces and build them up. So I started by joining one edge and then ripping a few pieces to just a little bit over 2 inches wide. And after that, I got out my crosscut sled, set up a stop block, and crosscut all my leg blanks to rough length. And then I could double them up to get the 2 inches thick that I needed. While the leg blanks were drying, I decided to make a little template of my leg shape out of plywood. So here I'm measuring and drawing out and cutting it on a bandsaw. And it's hard to notice, but there's a very subtle taper along the long inside edge. And in fact, it ended up being so subtle that it kind of seemed like a waste, like it made the production extra hard for almost zero benefit. So I ended up abandoning this. But anyhow, once the legs were dry, I used my joiner to clean up one of the faces and then cleaned up the other side and brought my pieces down to their finished size on the table saw. Now, in this shot, I'm marking out the actual cuts that I'm going to make on my leg, what I had previously done on the plywood piece. And then once that was done, I could head over to the bandsaw and make the cuts. So I started by cutting this 45-degree cut on each of the 4 legs, and then used my fence to make a rip cut that completed the shape on the side. Then I could take the offcut and tape it back onto the piece, mark out the same shape on the next side that I needed to cut, and then I could head back over to the bandsaw and complete the shape. And after doing those two things, if you don't mix anything up, it's going to leave you with the finished leg that looks like what you see in this shot. The next part of the base to tackle was the stretcher aprons. The straprons, I guess. And this was a pretty straightforward task of just ripping them to width and then cross-cutting them to length. And that's good, because I like straightforward. Not only in woodworking, but also in home security. And that's why I use SimpliSafe. No, but for reals. If you're not familiar with SimpliSafe, it's incredibly effective, reliable home security that's monitored by professionals 24/7 who will call you in an emergency and send police help if needed. For example, in the event of a break-in. And the best part is, it's really easy and intuitive to set up and use. One of the things that was important to me was getting a system that was unobtrusive and not an eyesore. And that's one of my personal favorite things about SimpliSafe. After you've put your system together on their website, it shows up in a box and you can install it on your own in minutes, and almost everything is completely wireless. And don't worry, it's equipped for worst case scenario, so if you lose power, Wi-Fi, or if the system's attacked, it's still gonna work. So here's everything that I decided to get. The base station and keypad, 4 entry sensors, 2 motion sensors, a security camera, a glass break sensor, carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, a panic button, a water sensor, which would let me know if something sprung a leak and can potentially cut down your home insurance, and 2 key fobs, which let us control the system when we're not next to the keypad. And like I said, installing everything and setting it all up is just, well, simple. And all the pieces are so discreet, you would really never even notice them, other than the base station, which is actually kind of cool looking, and the signs out front, which you'd want people to notice. SimpliSafe is awesome security, it's really effective, it's really easy to use, and the price is great. They're upfront with everything, and they offer fair and honest pricing with no contracts and no hidden fees. So if you've been thinking about a home security system, or even if you have one that you think could be better, check out SimpliSafe, put a system together, and see if it might be a better option for you. Just head over to simplisafe.com/4eyes, or better yet, click the link in the description. Alright, think Simply Safe. So with my pieces all cut to size and dominoes cut in for joinery, I started assembling. And I didn't have clamps long enough for this, so I wanted to try out 2 different methods to see which I liked better. First was using clamps to clamp other clamps to pull the whole thing tight. And this would have actually worked better with some scrap wood, but it did the trick and provides more than enough pressure. And then for the back legs, I decided to try using some strap clamps. And this probably gives less pressure, but still more than enough, I think. And it's honestly quite a bit faster and easier, so I'd go with this method if I were to pick only one. Next, I had to figure out how I was going to attach the base to the cabinet. And I decided to use some figure 8 desktop fasteners for this. And I'd say that this is probably my favorite way to attach bases and cabinets whenever possible, because they're super simple and they account for wood movement. So I picked mine up at Rockler. I just buy a bunch at one time, that way I always have them on hand. So if you want some, just search from there, and actually I'll just throw a link below. But anyhow, after I had mortised out the bulk with a drill press and a Forstner bit, I used a chisel to clean things up a bit, and that was pretty much that. Now, before attaching the 2, I wanted to put some kind of detail to create a visual separation between the base and the cabinet, and I often just use a simple right angle here, basically just a rabbet. But I wanted to try out a 45-degree chamfer this time, and I did this for a couple reasons. One, I thought that the angle might create some aesthetic cohesion with the rest of the piece. For example, echoing the angles here and here. And 2, because I had a chamfer bit and I didn't have a rabbeting bit. That made the choice easy. Alright, we're on the home stretch. Next, I did some pre-finishing to get some of the hard-to-reach spots before everything was assembled. And actually, I went ahead and got a first coat on pretty much everything at this point, and then did a bit more finishing when I got to the very end of the project. And when things were dry enough, I attached my desktop fasteners and took the whole thing inside to attach the base in the cabinet. Then the last thing to do was make a cord hole in the back panel and attach the back panel. It's kind of funny, or odd I guess, that this is the 3rd record player console that I've built on my channel, and I don't even personally listen to records. In fact, the only reason I have this record player is for staging record player consoles that I've built here on YouTube. And actually, now that I think about it, each of the 3 consoles has been by customer request. So I guess let that be a lesson to those of you who are looking to get into building custom furniture pieces. People who collect records want something nice to display them in, or on. And since it's a total passion project most likely, they're typically willing to spend a little bit more than they would otherwise on something more utilitarian, like, say, a bathroom vanity. Alright, that's enough hipster economics for today. Next week we'll look at elasticity of demand as it relates to the elasticity of scarves. But until then, special thanks to Pablo Peralta, Eric Gartner, Michael Alvis, Kurt Mills, Adam Pular, and the rest of my Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. Honestly, without you, I know I wouldn't be able to do this stuff at the level that I'm doing it right now. So I'm saying this officially, as in on the record. Thank you for everything. And if you want to find out how you can support the show too, check out the Patreon link in the description and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. All right, see you next time.